Hello and welcome back to another video, the first video on this channel in the year 2023, so I hope you all had a great new year. I wanted to take this first video to kind of take a brief sneak peek at the 2024 presidential election and what so far is shaping up to be the most likely scenario, which would be a rematch between former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden. Now, the reason I don't bring Ron DeSantis or any other Republican candidates in this scenario is because, quite frankly, nobody has announced a challenge to Donald Trump as of yet. And of course, there's 652 days until the presidential election. So that's, an eternity in politics. A lot can change. But as of right now, this is probably still the most likely scenario. Again, there's an argument to be made that DeSantis is certainly within striking distance in the Republican primaries, and we'll make plenty of videos on the Republican and Democratic primaries as they get closer. But right now, this is the most likely scenario, and of course, given the fact that the presidential election is so far away, there's a lot of things we can only infer on. We don't really have hard data to really back up certain things, although the 2022 midterms do sort of give us a little window into potentially how these states will be trending and how they'll ultimately vote in November. So we'll get right into the matchup, but before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider liking this video down below if you enjoyed and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. So anyway, let's get straight into it. We'll start off with the state of Nevada and make our way east across the country. Now, Nevada was one of the only states from 2016, 2020, and 2022 to trend more to the right. Of course, in 2016 and 2020, it voted for the Democrat by about 2.4%. And of course, this time around, Catherine Cortez Masto won by 0.8%, so less than a point, while other battleground states around the country trended more to the left. Of course, North Carolina is probably the only other battleground, and maybe Wisconsin, the only battlegrounds that trended more to the right. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, all trended more to the left. Even Ohio, if you still consider that more of a battleground. But I think this time around, again, Joe Biden is the incumbent president. That certainly does give you a slight boost, no matter how popular or unpopular that incumbent is. And of course, Joe Biden is not that popular. He's underwater by about 10 points. But you have to keep in mind that during the 2022 midterms, Biden was more unpopular then than he is now. Back during the 2020 midterms, you saw him underwater by about 12 points. Now he's underwater by about 10. It really didn't make a whole difference because the midterms ultimately became a referendum on Republicans and just the Trump brand of politics in general. And because of that, Republicans did much worse than many of the pundits, including myself, predicted they would based on all the fundamentals of American electoral politics. So given the fact that Biden's the incumbent and given the fact that I think Donald Trump has certainly eroded a decent amount of support from the 2020 election. Again, November 2020 to now, a lot has certainly changed, and Trump's campaign really isn't off to that strong of a start. So I certainly think that Biden would win the state of Nevada in a hypothetical matchup. I still think it would be very close given the fact that this state continues to trend more in the Republicans' direction, but I still think it'd be about a 2 or 3 point margin of victory for Joe Biden. Moving on down to the state of Arizona. This is a state that Republicans have repeatedly over the past couple of years fumbled races, very winnable races. We saw that in 2020 in both the presidential and Senate races, and we saw it again in 2022 in the Senate race and the governor's race. So Arizona Republicans have had a really tough time, and of course, I want to make a separate video on the Arizona Republican Party because I think there's so many things that they're doing wrong to try and attract voters to actually come out and vote for them, and they're turning a state that should be a red state still into more of a blue state. As a result, again, Donald Trump is not popular in the state. Joe Biden won the state before. Democrats continually win the state. I think Joe Biden would probably win the state of Arizona by about 2 to 3 points. Again, I don't think you'd see some sort of landslide victory for Joe Biden in a state like Arizona because, again, even though it's turning away from the Republican Party, there's still a lot of Republican voters there. And there's really a floor for Republicans at around 46, 47% at the moment. So I think Biden would probably end up winning by about 2 to 3. Alaska, Trump has not really been popular in Alaska. Of course, in 2016, he won the state by around 14 points. In 2020, he only won Alaska by about 10. I don't really think you'd see a drastic shift in the Democrats' direction, even with the victory of Mary Peltola. Again, that was sort of a special case. Alaska is still a Republican state. Donald Trump would still win it, but I think it would be around the same margin as his 2020 totals. maybe even as low as 8 percentage points. But I still think Trump would win Alaska by a likely margin. Moving over to the state of New Mexico, this is really just a debate as to whether or not this would be safe or likely. Again, I categorize safe states as states that go to either party by 12 points or more. New Mexico is a pretty politically stagnant state. It's stayed about that way for the past 10 years or so. Again, back in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the state by around 8 points. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state by 10.8%. I think you'd see a pretty similar total since Biden is not that popular in New Mexico. There really isn't a significant shift to the left that hasn't already occurred in the state. I think Biden would probably win the state by around 11 or so, just shy of maybe 12% to get it within that safe margin. Now we go down to the Lone Star State. Now this is a state where Republicans have been continually eroding support. In 2016, Donald Trump won the state by 9 percentage points. That's pretty embarrassing given the fact that Mitt Romney won the state by 15 points just 4 years earlier. Of course, in 2020, Donald Trump won the state by a little less than 6 points. And of course, now the question is, how much would Donald Trump win the state of Texas, if at all? Now, obviously, I think Donald Trump has the edge in Texas. Texas is still a red state, despite how unpopular he is compared to other Republicans like Greg Abbott and other statewide officials. And in 2022, the Republicans didn't really do bad in the state of Texas. If we pull up the Texas results from the midterms, and again, I want to specify again that midterms aren't always indicative. And again, I want to specify that midterms aren't always indicative of the presidential elections that follow them, but they do sort of indicate trends and how voters are receptive to messaging, because by all intents and purposes, Republicans should have landslided the 2022 elections given the fundamentals, the poor economy, Joe Biden's unpopularity, but it really was the opposition, the Republicans, that really dropped the ball. Now, Greg Abbott was able to win re-election by a more narrow margin than he did in 2018. He won by 11 points. That's worse than he did against Lupe Valdez in 2018, but it should be noted, however, that Lupe Valdez was a poorly funded opponent who really didn't have any name recognition. She didn't really get any help from the national or statewide Democratic Party. They really put all of their apparatus behind Beto, and Greg Abbott was much more popular back in 2018. So the fact that he still won by 11 points, given how poorly Republicans did around the country, I think is a pretty good sign for the GOP. Of course, Trump is a totally different entity. Again, back in 2020, he had the worst performance for a Republican since Bob Dole in 1996. But many people have argued that in places like the Houston Metro, and in some cases even the Austin Metro, Republicans have sort of bottomed out. But an area where I think Democrats still have room to grow is the Dallas-Fort Worth area, specifically Denton and Collin counties. If any of these counties are going to flip in the 24 election in favor of the Democrats, I think it would be these two counties up here, specifically Collin County, which almost flipped back in 2020. So while I think Donald Trump would still win the state of Texas, I think he would again continue to erode support among Republicans at large. I think he'd only win the state by about 2 to 3 points. Now that may seem a bit dramatic, but given the trends in Texas and given how unpopular Trump's brand of politics is in the suburbs, specifically the Dallas-Fort Worth area and the Austin area, these are the areas of the state that are growing, they're gaining in population, and these are areas that do not like Donald Trump. They've been shown to vote for other Republicans in higher numbers, but for Donald Trump, they really hold their nose, and in some cases will even vote for the Democrats. So I still think Donald Trump would win Texas, but it would only be a 2 to 3 point margin, really putting the Texas GOP on red alert for 2028 and future elections. Up in the state of Kansas, this is a state that's also sort of been trending towards the left. Again, just because it's highlighted doesn't mean it's going to end up being safe, but I did want to talk about it because Republicans in general, whether it's the abortion referendum or the governor's race, haven't been doing that well in the Kansas suburbs, at least compared to where they used to be. Now, Kansas is still a very red state numerically, but in places like Johnson County, Wichita, and Topeka, they've been significantly eroding support compared to where they have been previously. I mean, we could even look at the Senate race where you had incumbent Jerry Moran, who is sort of a household name in Kansas politics, even underperforming his 2016 margins in a lot of these counties. Johnson County still going blue. This was a county that Biden flipped in 2020, just sort of showing us that the suburban trends aren't going away. The Democrats keep doing better in the suburbs, and as a result, Republican support there is going to shrink, and Republicans are going to have to continue to try to max out these much smaller rural counties which is proving to be quite difficult, of course, in 2022. Really didn't make all that much of a difference when the Democrats were doing so much better in the suburbs. So again, back in 2020, Donald Trump won the state of Kansas by about 14 points. I think he'd probably win it by about 12, so it would still be a safe margin. But again, suburban trends are true in Kansas as they are in the rest of the country. They continue to hurt Republicans, kind of narrowing their margins over time. In Nebraska's second, this is a very suburban district. This is a district that went to Donald Trump by about 2 points in 2016, went to Biden by 7 in 2020. I think that trend would accelerate even more. I think Biden could probably win it by even 9 or 10. That would go likely in the Biden category. And, you know, again, certain Republicans are much more attuned to doing better in the suburbs than others, but Donald Trump has shown cycle after cycle that him and his brand of politics is incredibly toxic in the suburbs. And even with the incumbent party, the Democrats being unpopular, nationally speaking, when put up against Donald Trump or that type of Republican, they still end up voting for them because they'd rather vote for the Democrats that they don't view as favorably than a Trump Republican. Going up to the state of Minnesota, Democratic trends there would certainly continue. Biden won the state by 7. Of course, if we go to the midterm elections, Tim Walz, the incumbent governor there, did fairly well. Again, gubernatorial races aren't that indicative. But again, the 2022 midterms did show us that a lot of these suburban trends to the left have continued. I think Biden would probably win by a similar margin in Minnesota. Moving on down to Iowa, I think Trump would do about the same in Iowa as he did in 2020, about an 8-point margin of victory. Really no shift there one way or the other. Up in the state of Wisconsin, again, given this matchup between Trump and Biden, and again, it really depends how Trump decides to run his campaign. I'm basing this off of how Trump is running his campaign currently, which is to say it's becoming more and more fringe even than the 2020 campaign based on some of the election rhetoric and just the general tone of the campaign. Wisconsin was one of the closest states in the 2020 election. Joe Biden won it by 0.6%. Donald Trump won it by 0.7 in 2016. So this is one of the closest swing states in the country. Of course, in the 2022 midterms, Wisconsin sort of gave us a split verdict, re-electing Ron Johnson by exactly 1 percentage point, while also re-electing incumbent Democratic Governor Tony Evers by about 3 to 4. So it did deliver a split verdict. Again, as I mentioned, Wisconsin is that sort of quintessential real purple state. And I think Donald Trump will continue to erode support here in the WOW counties, which surprisingly enough don't make up that huge a percentage of the Wisconsin population. But you have to keep in mind that these counties just 4 or 5 years ago were voting for Republicans at around 60-70%. Now they're voting for Republicans in the high to mid 50s. And in Washington County's case, under 70%, which really doesn't happen or hasn't happened throughout the 2010s that often in some of these statewide races. So I think Joe Biden, just because he's doing well in these other swing states, he'd probably win the state of Wisconsin by around 2 to 3. It would still, again, be pretty close given the fact that Donald Trump is still popular in the rural parts of the state, which make up the majority of the state's population. But Trump would ultimately lose the state because he would do even worse in places like Dane County, Milwaukee, and of course the WOW County, as we talked about earlier. Moving on over to the state of Michigan. The Michigan GOP is in a state of total crisis and disarray after the 2022 elections. They essentially lost everything. They had control of the state house, the state senate. They lost all of that in the midterm elections. They ran pretty weak candidates statewide, and I think fundamentally damaged the Republican brand in the state. Joe Biden is unpopular in the state, as he is in other swing states, but I think, like in the midterms, when given the choice between Biden and Donald Trump, the state of Michigan will go to Biden decently, decisively. I think he'll probably end up winning the state by about 5 to 6. Biden's going to do even better in some of these suburban counties, places like Kent County, which were former Republican strongholds, Macomb County, Oakland, etc. These areas that were voting red previously are drifting more and more blue. I take back Macomb. I think Donald Trump probably would win Macomb. He won it by about 8 in 2020, but it would probably be more of a 4 to 5 point margin of victory. So I think Biden would probably win the state of Michigan by about 5 to 6 points. We'll keep it in the lean margin since 6 is really the bridge between lean to likely, but it would be a much more decisive victory than what we saw back in 2020. Moving on over to the state of Ohio. Ohio would go to Donald Trump still by around 7 to 8 points. 2022 proved that even when the Republicans run a weak candidate like J.D. Vance, they still have a fundamental edge in the state of Ohio. Tim Ryan, I thought, was a pretty strong candidate, and even he fell short by about 6 points. So I think Donald Trump would have no problem winning the state of Ohio if he were to be the Republican nominee in 24. Moving up to the state of Maine, I doubt really much would change. I think the 2nd district would still go to Donald Trump, but by a smaller margin than it did in 2020, probably around 6 to 7 points. And of course, Maine at large would probably go to Joe Biden by around 10 or 11. The Granite State would probably continue to move more towards the left. Now, New Hampshire historically does have this trend where it moves away somewhat significantly from the incumbent party. We saw this in 2012. We saw it in 2020 with Donald Trump. But I think Donald Trump is uniquely unpopular in the state of New Hampshire, and he'd probably end up losing the state by around 7 to 8 points, somewhat similar to his 2020 performance. Moving down to Pennsylvania, the same problem that Republicans have been having in the rest of these swing states will probably happen in Pennsylvania as well. That problem being that they've essentially maxed out their rural support and will continue to bleed suburban support. Again, Donald Trump is even more of a fringe candidate in 24 to the American mainstream than he was in 2016 or 2020. In fact, in 2016, you could argue many voters saw him as a breath of fresh air when compared to the neoconservative and neoliberal policies that basically dominated the entire 21st century. So in 2016, he was much more of a welcome political sight. In 2020, he was rejected fairly narrowly in Pennsylvania. And I think in 2022, we saw that trend continue with Republicans doing absolutely abysmal in the state. Dr. Oz losing to John Fetterman by 5 points. Josh Shapiro beating Doug Mastriano by 15, something I really didn't expect to see at all. I expected Doug Mastriano to lose, but by that margin, I was very surprised, and many Democrats were even surprised by that as well. But I think Pennsylvania would be a state where Joe Biden would do fairly well. He'd probably improve his margins slightly in Bucks County. Chester County, I think he'd probably do even better. Basically, in a lot of these swing counties where Donald Trump sort of bled support in the 2020 election, I think Joe Biden as the incumbent would do even better. I think he'd probably win Erie County by a majority, Northampton by a majority, and you'd see something closer to the Pennsylvania Senate result that we got out of Pennsylvania in some of these counties than we did the 2020 presidential election. So I think Biden would probably win the state of Pennsylvania by about 3.5 points, something like that. Moving on down to the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is really my debate of whether or not I want to put this as likely or safe. Again, Virginia Republicans seem to have had a floor statewide at about 44%. Donald Trump got 44% back in 2020. And of course, in 2016, he got 44.4%. That being said, I think Donald Trump's brand would be even more poorly received in Nova and the suburban counties of Chesterfield, Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake than they were in 2020. So as a result, I actually think Joe Biden would probably win the state of Virginia by about 12, which again, this is a state that really Republicans should be able to keep within single digits, but they need to run much better candidates for the very suburban, very highly educated Virginia electorate. Moving on down to North Carolina. Now, this is a tough state to categorize purely because it's very stagnant in the Republicans' direction. Of course, in the 2022 Senate races, Republicans underperformed their polls, which really doesn't happen in North Carolina, but they ended up doing so. Ted Budd only won the Senate race by about 3.2%. He was predicted to probably win by about 5 to 6. That was my prediction anyway. He ended up underperforming in that regard. Of course, in 2020, Donald Trump only won the state of North Carolina by 1.3%, and in 2016, he won it by 3.6%. So, from 2016 to 2020, there was an eroding of support, but of course in 2022, Republicans did slightly better than that. But the trends in some of these counties has been very alarming, and if the turnout percentage-wise was the same as 2020 in the Research Triangle, Charlotte metro area, Ted Budd would have lost this race in North Carolina. So the trends are actually pretty bad for Republicans. The only reason they won this time around was because turnout was lower in some of these metro suburban counties and rural turnout was actually higher. Again, if the 2020 turnout numbers were applied to North Carolina in 2022, Sherry Beasley would be in the Senate right now. So as a result of that, and again, I think it would be fairly close, I think Joe Biden would probably narrowly win the state of North Carolina. Now, of course, that's a pretty controversial call. Many people are going to disagree with me. But if I had to bet right now, if Donald Trump was going up against Biden again, I think he would lose North Carolina. Moving on down to South Carolina, this is a state that would go to Donald Trump. This is a state that actually has been trending more in the Republicans' direction. Donald Trump almost won the state by 12 points back in 2020. It was 11 points and some change, so just under a safe margin. I think he would still probably win South Carolina by about 10 or 11 points. I don't really think you'd see as much of a shift in favor of the Democrats, purely because the outstate migration that's coming into South Carolina is more conservative, sort of keeping the state about where it's always been politically. Moving on down to the state of Georgia. While Republicans did very well in the state of Georgia overall in the midterms, statewide anyway, the federal Republicans did very poorly. Republicans ran a pretty weak candidate. A candidate I thought originally, before he opened his mouth, was a somewhat strong candidate based on his roots in the state, Herschel Walker. Turned out to be a very weak candidate overall. Really wasn't cut out for politics. He ultimately ended up losing by about 2 to 3 points in the runoff last month. And of course, Donald Trump is partly to blame for that, given the fact that Herschel Walker was tied heavily to Trump in Georgia. And ultimately, Herschel Walker, in his own right, was a very poor candidate. So in this scenario, I think Joe Biden would probably win the state of Georgia purely because demographics are on the Democrat side. I think it'd be about a 2 to 3 point margin, but Democrats would continue to improve there. Finally, we get down to the state of Florida. This is a state that's been trending heavily to the right. Of course, the DeSantis numbers that we saw in 2022, I would never expect for somebody like Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump would do about the same as his 2020 performance. I don't think he'd really build on it, purely because again, he's become more of a pariah since he's left office, especially among independent, moderate, educated voters. So I think he still would win the state of Florida by a lean margin. But certainly with another Republican, perhaps a DeSantis or a Youngkin, Florida would be a much more decisive victory for the Republicans. So my current rematch prediction between Trump and Biden would have Donald Trump with 219 electoral votes, Joe Biden at 319. So anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.